Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Trader. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. Today we have Tehlor Kay Mejia on the show. She is the #1 best-selling author of We Set the Fire on Dark, as well as Paola Santiago and the River of Tears. Also, We Unleashed the Merciless Storm, and the new book, Paola Santiago and the Forest of Nightmares. Tehlor, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, well, Tehlor, the reason why we brought you on is because you're a prolific writer, extremely successful. And I want to start with, first off, where are you coming to us from? Where and what side of the country are you? And then you sound very young on the phone, so if you could walk us through your journey of how you became a #1 best-selling author. And I believe several of these books have even reached the New York Times bestseller list. So just walk us through that journey of how you were able to do that.
Yeah, I'm probably not as young as I sound. I'm definitely in my 30s, but
That's young. For New York Times bestselling author, that's young.
Okay, I'll take it. I'll take your word for it. I've been writing my whole life. I think I won like a poetry contest in the 2nd grade, and that's when I was like, okay, I think writing is what I like. So I've basically spent my whole life just like observing the world and trying to translate all the nonsense I see into stories. And it's funny that you say that I'm young to have reached this much success, because I feel like I've been doing it forever, and that the successful part has been such a blip near the end of like all the time I've spent working on it. But definitely these books, the Paola Santiago books, have reached the most readers out of anything I've ever written. And so it's just been like really crazy and fun to go from writing little stories for myself as a kid and a teenager, and then a little older I decided, okay, maybe I'm going to try to do this for real, and actually like finished my first novel and started going about the process of trying to find an agent and then a publisher. And so to be like doing all those things and like just hoping and praying for success, and then to get to the point where you're working with Rick Riordan and like thousands of people are reading your books, it's absolutely surreal.
Yeah. So how did you get into the like fantasy world? It's an interesting thing to go into. It's I'm personally a huge fan of like the fantasy adventure genre. How did you get into that?
I've always been a huge fantasy reader. So I think it's just like naturally where I've always wanted to be. I love the idea that you can take the problems of the real world and all the things you're facing, struggles in your everyday life that feel like kind of mundane, and translate them into like these huge otherworldly places and like monsters and adventures. And like it just seems more fun to tackle all the things that we have to tackle and all the themes that we struggle with in our regular life through battling monsters, instead of like going to therapy and doing normal stuff.
You mentioned the name Rick Riordan, and I know Adam's heard of Rick Riordan. He's, I would say, maybe like the top 5 greatest living fantasy writers in the world. How did you get involved with him? I'm assuming he identified you and recruited you. How did you get involved with him, and what is your collaboration with him?
Yeah, actually, I definitely went after him. I heard about his imprint, the Rick Riordan Presents imprint, which is, he started to give writers from diverse cultures a chance to write mythological adventure stories like his, but about their own cultures. And I heard about the announcement of the imprint and the first 3 authors that he had signed, and I immediately was like, this is what I've always wanted to do. Like, I loved the Percy Jackson books, and I was like, this is, I mean, you're right. He's in the top, definitely top 5, like most prolific, most successful living writers. And I was such a fan. And I was like, oh my gosh, the idea to write a book like Percy Jackson, but from my own cultural perspective, is like a dream. That's like the top of the bucket list. So I had my agent reach out to him and kind of pitched my idea for a story based on the ghost story of La Llorona, which is the first Paola Santiago book. And it was a real shot in the dark. We were like, he's so successful. I'm sure he's getting a billion submissions. But it turns out that Rick had grown up in South Texas, where the legend of La Llorona is really prevalent. And so he, despite not being from, Mexican culture, had already grown up like being terrified by the same story that I had. So the story resonated with him, and he was like, all right, let's do it. Let's turn it into a series about Mexican folktales and ghost stories. And the rest has been history. Right now, the collaboration is we get to write 100% of our own stuff, where we come up with the story ideas, we write whatever we want to write, and then he's really involved in the editorial process, and then also the promotional process of just kind of like spreading the word about the book, since he has such an incredible platform and reach. But we have so much creative autonomy to be able to write whatever we dream up, which is, yeah, it's the dream. It's amazing.
So how do you bring your culture into your writing? Like, what differentiates, your cultural writing from what people generally think of when they think of like fantasy adventure stuff?
Yeah, I think there's kind of this like European, like Anglo default when people think of fantasy. It's always like, it's like really
like your Harry Potter's type worlds.
Definitely. And but also the Tolkien stuff, like elves, and like everything really feels like European in nature. So I love a lot of those stories, but I definitely, as I was growing up reading a lot of fantasy, I was like, man, wouldn't this be cool if it had more of like the monsters and like the food and the family and the language of like the culture I grew up in. So it's basically just taking those fantasy ideas of like translating all these themes and making them kind of into these big external adventures and monster fights, but also doing that with like touchstones that felt like home to my culture. So definitely a lot more like ghost stories, and then I got to change the food to be more reflective of the food I ate growing up and stuff. So just it was like fun to do a story that felt like home to me, but still had all this big epic stuff that you come to associate with fantasy.
It's not just those topics, but you also touch on political topics or more mainstream current topics like immigration, feminism, LGBTQ, love in your works. So is there a specific reason or a message that you're trying to get across when delving into those topics?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like kind of going back to what I was just saying about growing up and reading a lot of fantasy stories that I didn't particularly see myself in. I feel like stories, especially fantasy stories, are some of the first times that kids get to see themselves in the role of a hero or be inspired to kind of tackle some of these bigger issues. And it seemed disingenuous to me and to the experience of like all the kids living in this culture to act like they could just kind of snap their fingers and be in this fantasy world, and all the issues and realities of the world that they have to face would just disappear. So I think like the goal of including all those kind of real world, more political concerns is to show that like these are things that kids are dealing with every day. And just because they're dealing with those things and they have these different marginalizations and they're oppressed in different ways by their community doesn't mean that they can't still have a fun adventure and also be a hero.
So how do you go about creating the world that your books take place in? Like, what's kind of your creative process? Are you writing, I'm assuming you're writing from home, maybe in your living room or, at the kitchen table or something. Kind of, how do you go about creating your work?
For these books, for the Paola Santiago books, the first one is set in the Southwest, which I grew up in Oregon, which is where I'm calling from now, and it's a very different place. But my grandparents went on vacation every year to the Southwest, and they would come back with all these like amazing photos, and I never got to go, but I really had this like belief from such a young age that it was sunset in New Mexico all the time. And so because all the photos had sunsets in them. So yeah, I'm writing from like a very different place, but a lot of times I just like infuse it with like the kind of wonder that I felt for places when I was a kid. So a lot of Pau's world and all the different places she goes, it's kind of like me getting to like pull in what I believed about places as a kid, kind of like add this fantasy wish fulfillment element. So like it's the Southwest in a sense, but also it's like the Southwest if a kid was dreaming it up. So there's all these like really like spooky cactus fields and like very dramatic sunsets, and the river is terrifying, and then of course in her stories there are ghosts and actual monsters pursuing her. So try to ground it in the real world a little bit to the point where people could recognize it, but also give it that sense of like fantasy wonder that makes it feel like another world too.
So have you ever lived in the Southwest?
No, I've been there a lot as an adult, but no, most of my descriptions of the Southwest are based on just like what I imagined it would be like as a kid. The second book is set in the forests of Oregon, which is definitely a little bit more my wheelhouse. I grew up like playing on 40 acres of forest that my grandparents lived on, and so it was definitely a little bit more more my speed to write about Oregon.
So is this planned out like it's a 5-book, 7-book series, or is this kind of like Hardy Boys style where you're just going to keep writing until they tell you to stop, or kind of what's the plan for the series?
It's actually wrapping up in book 3, so it's just a trilogy. So we just had book 2 come out, and then next summer will be the final installment, Paola Santiago and the Sanctuary of Shadows.
Will you continue with the Rick Riordan Presents, or will you go off on your own? Kind of what's your outlook for yourself there?
I would absolutely love to keep working with Rick Riordan Presents for as long as they will have me. I love working with them. It's an incredible imprint. It's run so consciously and sensitively, and they really make like an incredibly safe place for like diverse creators to write the stories that we all dream of writing. So yeah, it's a family. We all work so well together. We're doing an anthology actually with a bunch of the writers from the Rick Riordan Presents imprint called The Cursed Carnival, which will be out in October, and Rick wrote a story for it, and we all got to write stories from the universes of our novel series, and so it's just been such a fun, cool collaboration, and I would be happy to keep writing with them forever if they would let me.
What kind of advice do you have for people who are maybe maybe they're thinking about writing their first book? It probably wouldn't be your genre necessarily, but for our listeners who are thinking about writing their first book, they have a general idea, but what kind of writing advice would you give?
I think like the simplest and also hardest advice is just to finish it. Whatever you have in your head, write all the way through. Even if you get to a point where it's not really making sense, or you want to stop, or it doesn't read like the stuff you pick up at the bookstore, you're going to learn so much more from just getting to the end of the story than you will from stopping and starting 50 of them. So I think just like the knowledge that you can get to the end is such an important part of writing novels. And then there's always, as many rounds of revision as you want to make it all make sense afterwards. But the first big hurdle is just to get to the end.
So for a business book or a nonfiction book, I can kind of see how you could have an end in sight, because eventually you've given all of your knowledge or ideas out there. But how do you know you're finished with a fiction book?
I mean, for me, it's like, it's done when I've made it the absolute best that I can make it. And usually at that point for me, because I'm working with some really brilliant editors and stuff, there will be another round where I get to sort of use their feedback and advice to elevate it to the next level. But yeah, to me, it's like you're not done until it's as good as you can make it. So if you're reading through it and there's still things that you feel like you can improve upon, keep going. There will be a point that you hit where you're like, this is it. This is perfect. And then if you're very lucky, you'll get to work with people who are even smarter than you are that can show you where it can, be improved even further. But there will be a point where you're like, this is it. This is as good as I can do. And until you get there, I say keep going.
That's Tehlor Kay Mejia, #1 best-selling author of several fantasy books, including her new book, Paola Santiago in the Forest of Nightmares. Her website is TehlorKayMejia.com. That's Mejia. Taylor, and Taylor is spelled Tehlor. So TehlorKayMejia. Tehlor Kay Mejia.com. Taylor, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners or anything else you'd like to promote?
Yeah, all my books are listed on my website. I have a whole bunch of them, and feel free to check that out. I'm on Instagram at Tehlor Kay. I do a lot of writing advice and Q&As and a lot of promotion for other events and book stuff on there, so feel free to follow me if you're interested in that. And yeah, otherwise, just thanks for having me, and anyone who's writing, I hope you keep going with it.
Thank you, Taylor. It's been a pleasure having you on the Work From Home Show. And to all our listeners, check out all of our previous episodes at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to leave us, the email address is hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you utilize. Follow us on social media. We're not on Instagram, but we are on Twitter. We are on Facebook. We're on a few other platforms. And until next week, keep on working from home.